Good afternoon and welcome. Sorry, it's a little slower the setup there. So we'll continue with week 13 on consciousness and communication, and this lecture is on consciousness and its various states. There is your week 10 quiz statistics. So there was an average of 69 and a standard deviation of 14%. And for some of you, for about 3, you'll notice that your grades increased. And that is because when I set up those 2 bonus points, I did it wrong at first. And you would have been graded at a 32. And then I went back and fixed those manually. I have released the feedback for quiz 8, and I will release the quiz 9 feedback on Thursday. It is important to check your feedback. Now, I spend a lot of time sometimes writing test questions, and another instructor helped me out by sharing his test questions with me. And I thought, oh, well, that would be a great time to say, well, I'll kind of use a bunch of those, and they might cover like 10 out of 30. And I noticed when I was going through the social psychology questions, at first there was, oh, that's wrong. I thought maybe the wrong, just the wrong letter had been circled, and that's just a really easy mistake, and I'll see which one's the correct answer. And I read the question, I realized there was 2 correct answers. Okay, and I had to dump about 15% of the questions because of issues like that. Like there were really, it was vague, there was maybe more than one correct answer. And what I learned from that is that if you really know your stuff, if you knew your stuff inside out, and you took that exam, right, the exams that those were based on, you'd come out with an 85, not because you were wrong, because there was issues in the grading key. And the only way that you'd know that is if you ask for it back and look at what you got wrong and see what happened there. And that's also a really, and let's say that you were actually wrong. Well, that's how you're going to find out. And that's how that you can maybe identify the way you're thinking about a question. And that's how you can improve your own performance. But there's also a certain need, and I just kind of learned this, to check each other's work. Okay. The career development assignment is being graded. And Nikita projects that all the grades will be back by Wednesday, which is tomorrow. The last day to drop this course, right, to get a W instead of an F if that's, or a D if that's where the trajectory was going, was on March 17th. And actually, no one dropped the course. Well, one person did, and then asked if he could come back, and I said yes. There had been 23 students who had flagged as being on a course, being on a trajectory that looked like it would be a D or an F. And so one of the things I want to keep low in my class, I want to do my best to keep it low. I do what I can do within my role to keep it low. And I want you to do what you can do within your roles and responsibilities is keep the DFW rate low. So, sorry, I'm out of breath from all that preparation with the setup. The DFW rate was 19% for this course last year, and that's 19% too high. And so I had 23 flagged students who would have been referred to the early assist program and in the first sort of second or third waves. And I was really happy that I removed 11 flags. So when I went through that list, 11 of those people have changed course. And that's really awesome. So if I ended this course with a DFW rate of 12%, I'm really happy about that. And so thank you for all of your efforts to do that. Of those 12 remaining flag students, some of those cases are recoverable. Like still, like there's kind of, let's say the average is like, 45 or 55. And in some cases, they're not recoverable at this point. That's what the flags look like, by the way. So in a Brightspace gradebook, so all the students' names are there and all your grades, and then there's a little flag that the instructor can turn on or off, and that's flagged and that's not flagged. Okay, so today in lecture, we'll talk about consciousness, and that relates to your attention, what you're focusing on. We'll talk about the different states of consciousness, because this awake, aware state is not the only state of consciousness that you have, whether that's a normal state or an abnormal state, okay? We'll talk about some of the altered states of consciousness, including those that are brought on by exogenous agents. And I have put on a content warning for ableism that's related to stigma. So there's a place of consciousness in psychology's history that's important. In the 1880s, psychology as a discipline was defined as a discipline that focuses on the description and the explanation of states of consciousness. the first half of the 20th century was that behaviorist time of Pavlov and bells and salivation and little Albert. And things got to a point where psychology was just about observable behavior, and psychologists were not interested in your thoughts or feelings. We're like, we don't need those to predict what you're going to do. But then there was a cognitive revolution, and that came about in kind of the 50s and 60s when people were starting to develop and use computers. We started to use computers as an analogy, for example, of memory, right? Encoding and storage and retrieval. And then what else happened in the 60s that affected people's consciousness? People, including scientists, got into trying out things like LSD. And that makes you think about consciousness. Okay. So today, under the influence of the areas of cognitive psychology or cognitive neuroscience, consciousness has reclaimed a place as an important area of research. So when I talk about consciousness, what does that mean? What is consciousness?
Awareness of yourself.
Exactly. You're aware that you're in this room and you hear my voice. But there's a lot of other things in this room that are happening right now that you're not aware of. Maybe things you're just not focused on. Maybe things you can't detect, like some types of light waves. But exactly, yes, consciousness is your awareness of self and environment. The domain of cognitive neuroscience is the interdisciplinary study of the brain activity that's linked to cognition. And that includes perception, thinking, memory, and language. Now, I think it was week 1, I told you that the professional organization for psychology in Canada is the Canadian Psychological Association, the CPA. And that is true, but CPA over time began to represent the interests, the way of doing things of people in clinical psychology and people maybe in educational psychology. And it became less and less of a fit for people who were in cognitive psychology, who were in cognitive neuroscience, people who were in experimental psychology. And what they did was actually break off. So the professional organization for cognitive psychology, for cognitive neuroscience, is the Canadian Society for Brain, Behaviour and Cognitive Science. If you are interested in cognitive psychology or in neuroscience, Dalhousie has a department of psychology and neuroscience, and you can take some transfer credits. You can take Dal neuroscience classes if you're interested. And we actually do have a cognitive psychology. He's a Dal grad, cognitive psychologist here at St. Mary's. His name is Jason Ivanoff. He actually teaches the next class that's in this room, which is biological psychology. So like everything in psychology, there's some biological basis. There's a brain, a biological basis to consciousness. And it's something that arises from synchronous brain activity in different regions, including the cortex. And now, this is from your textbook. It's an example of an interesting study, but they found that if they asked healthy volunteers to imagine playing tennis, you imagine that involves certain specific parts of the brain, because there's a kind of maybe there's a procedural memory, it's physical, you think about the tennis court, you think about hitting a ball, and it's lighting a particular part of their brain up, right, a certain region. And now let's say you ask the person to, imagine walking through your house. Well, that's different. Okay, you're thinking about different things. You're not on a court waiting for a ball to come at you. You're actively walking through your house from this goes over there and that goes over there. And so it's lighting up different areas. And then when they asked a patient, I think the patient was maybe unconscious in this case. I can't quite remember. It's in your textbook, but the person can't speak, to imagine playing tennis, the same areas lit up. And then they asked this person to, when she wanted to say yes, imagine playing tennis. And if you want to say no, imagine walking through your house. Now, I don't know why they couldn't just do that with yes and no, but maybe thinking yes and thinking no don't light up brain regions in such a distinct way that could be used. So that's an example of an application of the biological basis of consciousness and how we can measure it. Okay, now I have a video for it. It has a really simple task, okay? So I want to start our exploration of consciousness with a really easy test. And all you have to do is count the number of passes of a basketball between people. And we'll see if your count is correct. And this should play, but it didn't, sorry. Okay, are any of you familiar with this experiment or with this video? Yeah. Have you done it before? Yeah. Okay, I'm seeing a lot. Can you hands up if you know exactly what I was going to do? Oh my goodness, well, good thing I didn't play it because you've already, what happens in this video?
Like they pass it back and forth, but then there's a gorilla or chicken or something halfway through. It's like how many passes were there? And it goes, did you notice the person walk right through or something like that? And so you're so focused on the basketball that you actually don't notice what else is happening.
Exactly. So what you said, and I'll repeat it a bit so that people on Zoom can hear. But basically, if you're told to count the number of times that the black players pass the ball between each other, or count the number of times the white players with the white t-shirts pass the ball between each other, you will not notice other things. And the other things that happen are super obvious. At one point, a gorilla walks into the middle of the stage and waves. And if you ask people if they saw the gorilla, they don't see it. Now, if you had known about this experiment and you'd know that that gorilla was going to come on, you would see the gorilla. And so what they did in this version, and I'll post it to Brightspace, is that they changed a bunch of other things as well. Okay, like at one point, the color of the curtain changes. Like people leave and come on. And we miss all of that. And so it was a pretty good example. And I regret that it didn't work. Okay, so inattentional blindness is a failure to see visible objects when your attention is directed elsewhere. And they can be super visible, right? Somebody walking in a gorilla suit and waving, that entire color of the background changing. And you just don't register it or remember it. And it's not in your memory of what happened. So change blindness refers to that failure to notice changes in the environment. And this is an experiment that also demonstrated. But in this experiment, you have a confederate of the experimenters. That's a research assistant. Go and let's say ask somebody for directions. And then the person's explaining the directions. And now another confederate, another research assistant comes through, oh, sorry, right? And I have to carry this very, very large and long piece of drywall. And then while that's happening, this person switches out with another person. It's a different person. And now you're talking to a completely different person, and people tend not to notice that. Like the entire person changed. You'll just kind of edit your memory to be like, yeah, that was the person you were talking to before. It'd be interesting to see variants of this study. So in this example here, they're both white men of different ages. But you know, what if you're talking to a woman next? Would you notice that? What if you were talking to somebody who was dramatically shorter or taller, or larger or thinner? Would you notice that? I don't know. I haven't looked into it. Films tend to have these sort of what we call continuity errors. So sometimes, let's say an actor's wearing a certain outfit and the buttons are done up. And a few frames later, the buttons are not done up anymore. Or maybe they changed part of their outfit, or their hair was down and now it's up. And we tend to not notice that either. And sometimes, let's say you have a historical scene, a plane will fly overhead. Sometimes somebody from the set will walk across the scene. And we tend to not notice those. Have you guys ever noticed continuity errors in a film? Sorry?
Depends on the movie.
Yeah.
I can't remember the movie. There was like this girl jumped into the lake. It was like during like some song. Next cut, she was completely fine.
So you saw that?
Yeah.
You're like, that doesn't work.
Yeah, it doesn't work.
Like the gorilla thing, I'll notice them if I'm told by the internet that they're there. But generally speaking, we don't notice them at all. I have another exercise. So I'd like you to take your dominant hand, be it right or left. I'm going to do a really, really easy task that I know all of you can do. Okay, and just take your hand and write the number 3. And let's keep doing that. Just make sure we can really do it for about 5 seconds. Okay. You can do that. You learned this in preschool. Yeah, that's super easy. Now let's do another really easy task. So if you're right-handed, probably also right-footed. Just turn your foot around, counterball. That's super easy. You can do that. Okay. Now you start drawing the 3. Keep that foot turning. I can't do it. Can you do it? Who says no? I can't do it. Okay. That bathroom. Who definitely thinks I can do this? Can do it? Would you be willing to prove it?
Okay.
It's hard to watch both your hand and foot at the same time.
Yeah.
To see if you are. Because every time I have the same problem with focus. I'm looking at your foot and I'm not looking at your hand.
Yeah. I found for me, it was like, once I got the leg moving, then
Yeah.
I focus a little bit on the hands.
If you can get something to the point that you're so expert at it, so used to doing it, you can put it on the implicit track and it's unconscious,
Yeah.
then you should be able to explicitly focus on something else. Okay, I don't have that. You can't do it. What some of you may be doing is quickly switching back between the 3 and the foot thing, right? Like stopping the foot and drawing the 3 and not realizing you're doing that. But it's interesting that I couldn't really tell because I can't watch 2 things at once. Okay. So, and that isn't about, in the example with the basketball and the gorilla, it's not about observation anymore. You're not watching something happen. It's showing that physically and procedurally, you can essentially sort of focus on one thing at a time. So we selectively attend to and process a very limited, very, very limited portion of incoming information. Remember that the unit of memory, that there's all this information coming into your sensory register, and only some of it goes into your short-term memory to be held there very temporarily, and only some of that goes into your long-term memory and becomes part of your story, part of what you remember. Okay, so think of that as the awareness and the short-term memory or working memory. Okay, and then so retention is kind of like a spotlight. We see what's under the spotlight and we move the spotlight around. So we've learned about the 2-track mind. You have an explicit conscious mind, and then you have that implicit unconscious mind, and they work together. So overall, looking at your entire mind, information processing involves both your conscious explicit mind and your unconscious implicit mind. And there are a lot of functions that you have that can be on automatic and implicit. So think about, well, breathing and blinking. You've all been doing that, and you've been doing it the whole time you're here, otherwise you wouldn't be here. And if you want to now, you can focus on your blinking, say, I'm going to blink a lot, or I'm going to stop blinking until my eyes start to hurt, right? Or you can control your breath a bit. You can go do that when you go swimming. So you have kind of like a conscious override function on what otherwise can be a process that's running on that implicit or unconscious track. Now, when you see something, so when I see an object, let's say a red ball, there's different parts of your brain that are involved in that. And your explicit visual awareness would be in your visual cortex. Now imagine if somebody had some kind of brain damage, like a stroke that damaged that. Well, they might not be explicitly aware of what they can see, but strangely, they act like they still see. So experimenters might set up a hallway and they put obstacles in the hallway, and the person can't see them, they can't report them. They're like, oh yeah, there's a blue box over there, and then you put something over here. Yet they'll be able to walk down the hall and successfully navigate them. Or because let's say it has something like a brick, and they can't see it, they there's a brick right over there. But if you ask them to reach out and pick it up, they will adjust their width of their grip, their grip stretch to just be able to do that. That shows you how different parts of your brain are creating that consciousness. And so that's called, what I just described there is called blind sight. So 2-track mind, we have parallel processing, where we are processing many aspects of a situation, a problem simultaneously. But then for your, if we're referring to your explicit awareness, you sort of have sequential processing for that. You can focus kind of on one thing at a time, right? That's why it's called focusing. So parallel processing takes care of the routine business. And then sequential processing is used for kind of new problems that require your attention. And as we know, once you become an expert at something, you can put it on that implicit track. Now imagine, think about when you're learning to drive, like the first time you were in there with your driving instructor, or maybe your dad, and how aware you were of, you know, the pedals, how much pressure to put on them, of the steering wheel and what it's doing. Right? That was all on the explicit track. But if you've been driving for a while, you may now have experienced a situation where you're driving somewhere and you get there and you don't remember doing that because it went on that implicit or automatic track. Now, parallel processing is a thing. You can have things on the explicit track, maybe one thing, and a few things on the implicit track. But multitasking, which is the idea that you're doing many things at once on the explicit track, is a lie. Okay? You focus your conscious awareness on a particular stimulus, even when you think you're attending to the whole scene. But you're not really, you're not noticing the gorilla come in or the color of the curtain change. Okay, that's why it's called focusing. And when people talk about multitasking, what they're really referring to is switching back and forth, okay, between tasks quickly. And that is shown to result in poorer performance across all those tasks compared to if you really focused on one. Sometimes in life you have to, but it's not ideal. So you can't text while you are driving. What you are doing is driving and then texting and then driving again and then texting again. And it's not a good strategy. In fact, even just talking to a passenger increases the risk of having an accident because you're less focused on the road, obviously. So we have different states of consciousness, and this is not an exhaustive list. That's a table from your textbook. Some of them are natural and expected and occur spontaneously, like daydreaming or sleeping. Some of them are physiologically induced. So for example, through fasting. How does fasting make you feel? A lot of cultures do it spiritually, as a spiritual practice. It does change your kind of state of consciousness. Some are psychologically induced, say hypnosis. Does anyone know what hypnosis is? It's a real thing. Some psychologists hypnotize their clients. It's a state where you're very suggestible, very obedient. You will do what the hypnotist tells you to do. When I looked at this table for the first time and I saw orgasm, I thought, what the hell? Are they really serious about this? So I asked the students in last year's class if they thought this was true. I asked a bunch of my colleagues, and overall they said yes. And I still didn't buy it. So I went and searched Google Scholar, and in fact, I did find something. So it seems to be legit. They also mentioned sensory deprivation. Sensory deprivation is the deliberate reduction or removal of stimuli from one or more of the senses. Short-term sessions of sensory deprivation can be used therapeutically, like they can be relaxing. Does anyone know what that is? Recognize that?
The first one,
Yeah,
it's a float tank.
yeah, it's an isolation tank. And have you ever been on one?
No.
I haven't. They're supposed to be nice. Maybe just having everything taken away from you for a while is a good reset. Okay. But now let's say that the sensory deprivation was extended and severe and forced. Now you're going to have extreme anxiety, hallucinations, bizarre thoughts, senselessness, depression. You can even lose your sense of up and down. And that can be accomplished with devices like blindfolds or hoods and muffs that cut off your sight and hearing. And so there's ways to cut off all those senses like touch and taste, even thermoreception, even your heat scent. Does anyone know what those other pictures are? This has been used as a form of torture. And so some of these techniques were developed and used by some of the armed forces within NATO as a way of interrogating prisoners, but in a way that's within the international treaty obligations for how you treat people. It's so compliant with the letter, but not the spirit of the Geneva Convention. So that's not a pleasant experience. So by contrast, sleep is a natural and healthy state of consciousness. And what is sleep about? Why do we do that? And we spend a lot of time sleeping. So why do we sleep?
Are you talking just the body in general, kind of like the way that we gain energy naturally?
Yeah, so it's like rest and restoration. So you wear your body down a bit throughout the day, and it gives you a sense to recover, right? Even for neurons to make connections. So throughout the day, your body builds up these metabolic byproducts, and when you sleep, you have a chance to clear those out. What else? What other purpose does it serve? What else is it good for?
Repair injuries.
It does, yeah. So if you're not sleeping, your body's not going to repair as well. What does your hippocampus do while you're sleeping? Yes.
Processes.
And what does it do that's special? It's like a little library book truck. Yes, memory consolidation. So if you have a test, it's a good idea if you can to sleep before the test, unless you really haven't done anything and you need to cover all the material overnight. So memory consolidation. And I think they say that some of the best time to study, like if you need to cram, is like the hour before you go to sleep. During deep sleep, the pituitary gland secretes growth hormone that's necessary for muscle development. Now, some animals are adapted to be up in the day and they need to be out of trouble at night. And some animals are adapted to be up at night and they need to stay out of trouble during the day. And sleep also has an adaptive function there. So it's an animal that's adapted to the night. Bats, right? Hamsters, cats tend to sleep during the day and stalk things at night. And then we're adapted to the daylight, and during at night, we get together with our fellow humans and stay in our cave. And that helps us not get eaten by the saber-toothed tigers. What else? So different animals sleep for different amounts of time. Cats, whether they're house cats or tigers, sleep They sleep more or less than humans. More, yeah, they sleep about as much of it as a newborn baby. And why might that be? Why would a cat spend a lot of time sleeping? What kind of energy level does a cat, it's an obligate carnivore, can only eat meat? What kind of energy level does it need to have in order to get food? Really high, right? Because that prey animal, that little mouse, is fighting and running for its life. It's not giving the cat an easy time. It's not like, hi, I'm food. Okay, so they need to be able to stalk their prey and attack it and go, 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 chase it to exhaustion, fight it and kill it. So they'll sleep a lot and then they have these really high energy bouts, but we're not like that. Right? Cows aren't like that. Okay, so sleep is a periodic and natural loss of consciousness. And that's distinct from unconsciousness you get from coma or being under anesthetic, or if you're a bear hibernating. And it follows a biological rhythm. It has a daily rhythm that's known as a circadian rhythm. Other rhythms in your body are on kind of a different calendar. And one example would be like a menstrual cycle. That's on a monthly kind of cycle. But there's a daily cycle for sleep. You sleep every day. And throughout the day, you'll have different energy levels. Before you wake up, there's a big flood of stress hormones, okay, that help you wake up. And if you stay up all night, you'll notice these strange lapses in your energy. Like at a certain point of the night, for me, it's like, I don't know, maybe 3 a.m. It's so hard to fight off the sleep. But then maybe around sort of 7, this energy comes back to you. And that's that. And there's some variation in this between people. Like some people are more awake in the morning, early birds, and some people are more awake at night, or night owls. And there's some relation to that with age. So as people get older, they start waking up sooner and sooner. And that also has to do with the amount and quality of sleep that they're getting. It is sensitive to light. There's your sleepiness is related to a hormone called melatonin that is released along with, that's related to the exposure of light. And some people take melatonin supplements. Have you ever done that? Does it work?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, I passed out.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh. I know that some people like swear by them, and I don't think they do anything for me. But that's interesting. But yes, you can take melatonin as a supplement to put yourself to sleep, and it works very well for many people, as you yourself have confirmed. Okay. So there's some genetic influence on your sleep. At the biological level, bright light activates light-sensitive proteins. This is a process that goes through your eye that trigger the suprachiasmatic nucleus to cause a decreased production of melatonin in the morning. So it's going to wake you up because melatonin makes you sleepy, and increases it at night. So you feel sleepy. There's also a cultural effect on sleep, or cultural patterns to sleep. The people that make the decisions about what you should be doing tend to be older adults, right? And they think that starting class at 8:30 in the morning is a good idea. And maybe it's easy for them to get up at 6 in the morning or at 7 in the morning and get to class. But in fact, teenagers do need more sleep. And there's evidence that it's better for teenagers to have more sleep and to start classes later. They have better test scores if you do that. And then in some countries, there's something called a siesta. Is anyone familiar with that? Yeah, like it's normal. Like in this culture, we keep going through the day and then we go home at night and we're tired and watch TV. But in other cultures, and they tend to have hotter climates, it's normal for people to take some time out in the day and sleep. I think it's usually after lunch. And they tend to be hotter climates where it's like way too hot to do anything at noon. And that might be their heaviest meal of the day. And then we'll have a lighter meal later on. We tend to have a heavy meal in the evening. So there's ways that we measure sleep activity, particularly EEG, but other things we can look at are eye movements. There's certain periods of your sleep cycles when your eyes are darting around, and that's when you're having those vivid story-like dreams in REM sleep. You can look at the muscle tension in your face, and then we can look at your brain waves. And it was these people who figured out how to do EEG, and they're sort of messing around with it. And one was a graduate student who was doing this to his kid, and his kid fell asleep, and he noticed that the pattern changed. And this is how we discovered these sleep stages. So when you're awake and alert, like hopefully you are now, you have what's called beta waves. Okay. Now, the first one that was discovered was on a sleepy toddler. So when you're getting drowsy and you're maybe getting ready for sleep, okay, you have a relaxed but still awake state. That's the alpha waves. You can see they have a different shape. Then, say you start to go to sleep, you might notice that sometimes your body suddenly jerks. Sometimes you might feel like you're falling backwards and you startle a bit. Okay, that you might have hallucinations then, but they're different from a dream. And in fact, if we talk to people who say that they've been abducted by aliens, there's a particular arc to that story. And it's usually that, they're in bed. It didn't happen when they were at the breakfast table. It didn't happen when they were taking their morning jog. It happened when they were going to sleep. That's when the mothership came. And then they start kind of like floating up into this beam. It's a floaty feeling. So certain types of hallucinations that occur in N1 sleep. Then you go deeper in N2, and there's slower waves, and you start seeing something called a sleep spindle, which is just a specific kind of wave. Then you go deeper and deeper into sleep, and in N3, see these slower, larger delta waves. And then you have something called rapid eye movement sleep. Obviously, it's when your eyes dart around. And that is when the whole body is aroused. That includes people's sexual organs for men and for women. And you have these story-like dreams. And they're often bizarre, and they're often negative. And interestingly, your body is also sort of paralyzed. You're not tossing and turning or moving around at that part of the sleep cycle. Now, things can happen to people, and that REM paralysis is lost. And if it is lost, they will get out of bed and act out their dreams. Right? They will actually go and punch someone or something. Can you imagine like how dangerous that is? So there is an association between sleep and age. And what does this graph tell you? About the quality of sleep between young adults and older adults. So here you have amount of time in REM sleep that's associated with, let's say, memory. And then these are like the shallower sleep, deeper and deeper.
Yeah. People more often sleep.
Yes, yeah. So as people get older, the quality of sleep gets poorer, gets shallower, it's more fragile, and they wake up more often during the night. Now here's sleep and age, and you can see how much time spent in REM sleep, how much time is spent in non-REM sleep, and how much time is spent awake. And what this shows you is that younger people, the youngest people, sleep the most, right? 16 hours a day is how much a cat sleeps. And it gets less and less over time. And then these 45-year-olds that are planning your educational experience, they need a lot less sleep. and they wake up earlier. So what happens if you don't sleep? What can you expect? Knowing what you know about what sleep does. Say if you get sleep deprived, maybe not just one night. What are some changes that you could expect to have happen? Yes, that's a great one. Fatigue. What is fatigue going to mean for your task performance? It will. So reduced sort of task performance. I mean poorer task performance. It also makes you slower. Your movements are slower. Your reaction times are slower. What is it going to, yes?
It increases chances of depression sometimes.
It does, yeah, that's really, really important. It is a strong predictor of depression. In fact, you could ask, what is the overlap between depression and being underslept? So it puts you in kind of a negative mood. So it's more than just a negative mood. It's a sort of a hopeless negative mood. Yes.
But don't people who are depressed usually tend to sleep more too?
Yeah. So when you look at the criteria for depression, one of them is like disruption to sleep. Like I think they might have both of them on it. Like either you're not sleeping or you're sleeping a lot. There's some sleep issue. So most people are have a sleep debt, are a bit sleep deprived. And if you would just let most people sleep all day, they'll feel better afterwards. So one of the first things you want to check on if somebody is having a really low mood, et cetera, is are they sleeping enough? And then now if you start to mess up your sleep, and there are also risks of oversleep. Right? If you were keep doing that and keep staying in bed, that probably wouldn't have a good effect either. But I see that there's some need to disentangle the sleep thing and the depression thing. Like if you could work on someone's sleep, get that right, are they still going to be showing depression after that? And maybe some people will. Like maybe the depression, which is basically a constellation of symptoms, they can have multiple causes. And maybe for this one client, the answer is being on an SSRI. Right? Maybe for someone else, it's addressing their negative cognitions. And so it's challenging. Right? It's even with things like ADD, it's a cluster of symptoms. Right? What is the cause? What else will lack of sleep do to you? Yeah, it's bad for your memory. That's a good one. So you'll have memory problems. Back to the sort of depression thing or the negative moods. It's also associated with a lot more relationship conflicts. Like if you're in a negative mood, you're having negative cognitions, that's going to affect your ability to deal with others effectively, and dealing with other people takes a lot of energy. So it's associated with more relationship conflict. I don't necessarily want to problematize conflict. It can be dealt with well, but let's say maladaptive relationship conflict. What is it going to do to your body physically? Does it speed up your metabolism or slow your metabolism? It does. It slows your metabolism and makes people more hungry. Makes you hungry. And it makes you gain more weight from the same amount of calories. There's weight gain. Handwriting is terrible. I have to work on that. Yes.
Would you say just because you're not getting enough sleep, your body's looking for other methods to get the gain back?
Yeah, like it gives you energy, But if you're really tired, you might go and you might want to go and eat chocolate bars. You might want to eat sweet things. They'll give you that boost. So yeah, it's associated. That's a really good point, and it's actually true. It's associated with like poorer food choices, ones that give you more energy. So more sweet, more fat. Especially sugary things that can give you that boost. Okay. So what do you think it does to your immune system? Takes a lot of energy to run an immune system. Yeah, it suppresses it, so you get sick more. It's a good way to undermine yourself system, so you get more sick. Other ones are that people have more joint pain and more muscle problems. That's all I can think of, in case I'm missing anything. Now, oh, you also have more accidents because you have poor task performance and slower reaction time. You can imagine that if you are driving, that can be a problem. And this is a graph from your textbook, and it's rather dramatic. What is this? So in here we have the spring time change, which is about, spring forward and fall back. Okay, so you lose an hour of sleep, as we recently did in the spring. And they're looking at the Monday before the time change versus the Monday after the time change. And now they're doing the same experiment. They're counting the number of car accidents at the time of the fall time change. So fall back, you gain an hour of sleep. So the Monday before that versus the Monday after that. So taken together, what does the set of graphs tell you? About the relationship between accidents and sleep? Yes. Yeah. So if you lose sleep, you're having more accidents. And if you gain sleep, there's less accidents. I find this example a little bit manipulative. Why might I think that? Is this a scrupulously honest way of presenting the information?
Well, it's sort of, it doesn't start at 0.
Exactly.
It's just the size of the difference.
They're zooming in on the differences. So just as you said, this axis doesn't start at 0, right? They've zoomed in on the difference between these two bars. They set it at 2,400 accidents there and 3,600 there. I wondered, well, how would this look like if you were to set it to 0? And so I did that in Excel, and I made these new ones, and you can still see the same relationship, but it's much less impressive. Okay, so if you're telling a story with a picture, I think we still want to do that ethically, accountably, and transparently. And those graphs in the text do exaggerate that difference. And maybe you're doing that because you think they're going to help you, or it's going to convince you to sleep more and not be in a car accident. But I don't love that. So I've convinced you, I hope, that sleep is important. What could you do if you wanted to sleep better? Any idea? Yes. Yes, that is great. We were not made to have bright lights shining in our faces all night. So limit screen time. There, you can also change it to more of a blue glow, to more of a yellow glow. It's a harm reduction technique. Limit screen time, especially in the 1 hour before bed. Yes. Yes, that's another great one. Any other ideas? Yes.
not sure about this, but like you meditate, I assume.
Yes, you can relax yourself before bed instead of like winding yourself up and thinking about all your problems. And so one way to do that might be to meditate. Another thing some people do is write down their thoughts in sort of thought dump in a journal. It's a way of kind of taking them out of your head so you can relax. So yes, that is a good idea. Any others? Sticking to a routine helps when your body expects it versus if like people who do shift work really get messed up sleep. So having a schedule. What else? Stress will keep you awake. So managing your stress. A stressed organism is one that is vigilant, right? That is tense. That makes it hard to go to sleep. Yes.
Oh, I'm supposed to be doing something.
Brilliant. Yes. Mental associations. So if you do other stuff in bed, let's say that you work on your laptop and you participate in email flames from your bed, then you'll associate that tension and being awake and on with being in your bed. But if you do that stuff from your basement office, well, then you can have that associated tension there. And if you just sleep in your bed and not watch TV, etc., then you'll associate your bed with sleep. And that is called sleep hygiene. That's a really good one. I don't know if that was even in the book, but it's about your memory and your associations. Now, you can imagine how important sleep is for fighter pilots. Imagine the harm that a sleep-deprived fighter pilot might do. And this is a problem that the military has addressed. There's quite a strong connection between the military and psychology and discipline as a whole. Right? They might hit the wrong target. Right? What if you fell asleep when falling asleep while you're driving a car is bad enough? Imagine if it's a plane. Okay, just plane crashing. And imagine how hard it would be to fall asleep in a war zone. So the US Navy pre-flight school scientifically developed a method to fall asleep in under 2 minutes. And it took about 6 weeks of training. And after that, 96% of the pilots could fall asleep in 2 minutes, even after drinking coffee, even with machine gun fire being played in background. So apparently it works pretty well, but it's based on what you learned about. Remember, you learned about facial feedback. So if you smile, you feel happy. People who get Botox feel less anxiety and depression because they're not frowning. When you're staying awake, you're thinking all these thoughts and you're screwing your face up. So if you intentionally relax the muscles in your face, including your tongue and your jaw and the muscles around your eyes, that will help you go to sleep faster. And then once they do that with the face, and move down the whole body. There are sleep disorders. A common one you may have heard of is insomnia. And insomnia is a bit paradoxical because a lot of people who swear they have insomnia are actually the ones that are keeping you up with their snoring. And the reason for that is that they remember the parts of the night that they were up for. And they don't remember parts of the night that they were asleep for. That's a fairly common problem. People having insomnia, but not really having it. But then it's also a real thing. And I'm sure you've all had that night where you just couldn't sleep. Maybe you were thinking about a lot of things. Alcohol and sleeping pills are not great strategies for going to sleep. Alcohol does help people fall asleep, but it disrupts the quality of your sleep and you'll wake up more. Okay, so it's not a good one. Sometimes if you're taking a sleeping pill, you might not be able to get up or wake up if something happens that needs you to wake up. One of the saddest sort of kidnapping cases I read about was when a child was abducted from her home and her mother didn't wake up because she'd taken her sleeping pills. And some people have other needs to wake up during the night to take care of a kid, to test their blood sugars, whatever. So you kind of mess with your ability to do that. There's a condition called narcolepsy. I haven't looked into the biology of it, but sometimes people who are aroused, like if there's a funny joke and they laugh, and they suddenly fall asleep. It can happen with like stress. Let's say they're stressed in an exam, so they just fall asleep. Sleep apnea is something that tends to happen with older, heavier men. What happens there is that they get, kind of because of sagging of structures, a physical obstruction that stops them from breathing. So they're sleeping and they stop breathing, and then there's like a reflex and they gasp. And there's a terrible noise. It's hard to sleep next to somebody who has sleep apnea. And there's interventions for all of these things. There's a sleep lab at the hospital. It's associated with the psychology department. Some people have something called night terrors. It's usually younger people or children. They'll just like wake up screaming. It's not the same thing from waking up from a bad dream, because it didn't happen from REM sleep. Though they might have had some kind of hallucination or something really scary. And then some people talk in their sleep. Some people walk in their sleep. I go to the kitchen and get food. I don't remember doing any of it. But it's rare to do more complex behaviors. There are some people who can drive a car while they're asleep, but that's relatively rare. Like most people might just like go to the bathroom and maybe go the wrong way. And that happens. It's a disruption of N3 sleep. And then a really dangerous one is REM sleep behavior disorder, right? Where the paralysis doesn't set in and you act out your dream. And most dreams are kind of negative and a bit scary and bizarre. So what are dreams? So there's dreaming at night, and there's different kinds of dreams. And then there's daydreaming. And daydreaming refers to a mild dissociation from your current task, what you're supposed to be focusing on, sort of go off into a bit of a personal fantasy world where maybe you're thinking about something, thinking about something you've done, thinking about something you will do. You all do that. An estimate of how much time people spend doing that is about half your time. So most people, are spending most of their time not focused on what they're doing. And mindfulness refers to those strategies that bring you back to the present moment. Because sometimes the dream worlds we construct are not very good ones. So if you are like most people, you'll listen to me here for the first 20, 25 minutes. That's your attention span for doing something that's fairly difficult, like listening and taking notes. And then you'll be kind of tired and you'll dissociate. And you'll find yourself thinking about something else. Something that happened, something that might happen, something that could have happened if you'd done something differently. And that's easier on your brain. Those can play out a bit slower, a bit less effortful. Or maybe it's just something you're interested in. And that daydreaming takes a lot less mental effort than the really actively listening and focusing thing, which can be kind of exhausting. And you have about 20 minutes of that in you, okay? And maybe you need to take a little break, and then you come back to listening after 10 minutes of daydreaming. And I think that's one good reason for like recording lectures, because you go back and watch the 10 minutes that you dissociated for. Dreams that happen to you at night when you're sleeping are different, and there are sort of a sequence of images, emotions, thoughts, and they're usually bizarre, and they're usually weird, and there's usually negative emotion. Like they're a bit scary. You're running away from some kind of monster. Something terrible happened, and you wake up and you're like, oh, okay, that didn't happen. And they often incorporate things that are around you in some way. So if you're sleeping and the radio's playing, what's being said on the radio might somehow figure in your brain, or things that you did in the previous day will somehow figure into the dream. There are 5 major views of the functions of dreams. There's Freud. You will probably know Freud as the psychologist who thought that everything was somehow about sex. And he would say that it's a way to satisfy our own inappropriate desires. And Freud would say that, let's say you have a dream about smoking a cigar. Well, that's the manifest content, but really there's a symbolic level where it's somehow about libido. And smoking a cigar really represents, well, you know what that is, and that would be called the latent content, right? Freud also identified the defense mechanism projection, where it's really about you, but you think it's about somebody else. And so I would suggest that maybe that's really about his relationship with cigars. She did smoke a lot of, actually died from that cancer of the jaw. Then there's the information processing theory, and it's the idea that you're doing that memory consolidation. It's helping you sort out the day's events and consolidate them into your long-term memory. Other people will say that there's a physiological function of dreams, and that it stimulates your brain in a way that helps develop and preserve neural pathways. That's also about memory. Then some people would say that, there's a lot of, while that's, let's say, while you're sleeping, your brain is cleaning things up and making connections, and that's going to activate memories or thoughts, and your brain is trying to figure this out, like what the heck is going on, and tries to create a story. And your dream is that story that has a foundation in kind of some random, not random, but what we might call some neural static. And then the last one I find a bit strange, the cognitive development one, which says that dreams reflect the dreamer's level of development, and that, say, a younger child has different type of dreams than an older person. But I don't understand how that's an explanatory theory at all. It sounds like a fact. Like older people have more complex ideas because they have more complex brains. So it's not really explaining anything to me, and I don't really see how that's a theory. Okay. On to drugs. So humans use various substances to alter their states of consciousness, and many different cultures do this, and they have their psychoactive substances of choice. In this culture, alcohol is a big one, but in Southern indigenous cultures, peyote is a big one, and they have social scripts around how you use it and when you use it, and what's an appropriate use and what's an inappropriate use. The most commonly used psychoactive drug in the world, and a psychoactive drug is a chemical that alters your perceptions and your mood, is caffeine. Yeah, and you take that because it makes you more alert. Take too much, you'll get jittery. So caffeine is a drug. There are different kinds of drugs. There are ones that are medicinal, ones that are recreational, there's ones that are legal, and ones that are illegal. 18% of people in Canada report ever having used an illegal drug in their life. When I hear something like that, I think, oh, that's a lifetime prevalence rate, and it depends on how old the person is. So not knowing how old the average person is, that just doesn't mean very much to me. And it could be underreported. Like, if you have done something illegal, how likely are you going to tell, like, that's some psychology professor? The estimates for people who've used cannabis are a lot higher, about 42%. And hallucinogens are probably the most used illegal drug, followed in Canada, followed by cocaine or crack and ecstasy. There are three main types of psychoactive drugs. So there's drugs that kind of calm you down, that are downers. What might be an example? Yes. Exactly. And there's drugs that we take, that people with anxiety might take to make themselves feel calmer. Then there are drugs that stimulate you, they rev you up. What might an example of a drug like that be? Yes.
Cocaine, crystal meth.
Yeah, exactly. And then there are drugs that make you see things in a different way. They distort your perceptions. Seeing some kind of spiral is really common. And what might one of those be? Marijuana is a mild hallucinogen, but magic mushrooms, that'll cause hallucinations. So they can call up sensory images or feelings without any input from the senses. Now, is alcohol a stimulant or a depressant? It is, but I'm confused because alcohol is associated with people dancing and partying and having a ton of fun. What's going on there?
antidepressant doesn't mean it's like depressing, it means that it like depresses some of your body's function.
And if you drink enough, it will.
Yeah, yeah.
What happens in the earlier phases of someone drinking? It's shutting your body down. But the first thing it shuts down are your inhibitions. So it's depressing things in your brain, things that might involve your frontal lobes. And that makes people feel like they can kind of let go, right? Let your hair down and have fun and stop worrying about what other people think. But if you continue that, then you'll really start to see people slow down and slur their speech and stumble and at some point pass out. There are also expectancy effects. So we think, in this culture anyway, that that alcohol is fun, and we expect that if we're going to a fun party, alcohol will be served. And if you give people a placebo and you tell them that it's a drink, they might, start to have fun. And people would know if you gave them a lot, they'd realize that there was no alcohol in that. But to some extent, there's also an expectancy effect, is what we think that alcohol will do. So different drugs have different effects on your body. This is a table from your text. I do just want to point out the nicotine one, because they'll sort of say that, okay, too much of this, do this too often, you'll get, say, cancer. There are different ways that people administer drugs, and this is kind of getting it when it's in tobacco, like when you're smoking it. And a harm reduction is something like vaping. It's not going to be associated with lung cancer in the same way. I don't know what the association is, but it's definitely a lot safer. I'm not aware that there's any long-term harm to just taking nicotine, let's say, in a patch or as a gum. So what is causing the harm there? Is it the nicotine, or is it something about inhaling smoke and tobacco smoke? Like, there's a lot of other things in cigarette smoke than just nicotine. Okay, if you use a drug, it's going to affect your neurotransmitter systems. And so a rush can then have a flip side, which is a crash, which is after something that got kind of overused, then gets depleted. And if you sort of keep using a substance, your body can get used to it. And your body might say, well, I don't need to produce that anymore because you're already giving it to me. And now that's how you start to develop a dependence over time. So at some point, use of a substance is maladaptive and is causing harm to self and others. And that's when we call it a substance use disorder. And there are criteria for calling something a substance use disorder. And so there's a list of things that have to do with control, social functioning, dangerous use. Sometimes people continue to use a substance when they don't want to be using it anymore. They really, really want to stop drinking and they just can't. Right? That's there. And then there's the experience of tolerance and withdrawal. So if you have 2 or 3 of those symptoms, that's mild. If there's 4 to 5, we call it moderate. And if you have 6 or more, we call that severe. Okay. So with repeated use, to get the same effect, you need more and more. And that can develop into an addiction. And people have compulsive craving for the drug. There are also behavioral addictions like gambling. That's a psychological addiction. And then withdrawal can be very difficult. It can also be dangerous. If somebody has a severe alcohol use disorder, they just can't stop, right? That requires medical support because their body is so dependent on it. If you take it away suddenly, that could really harm them. People mix drugs, right? Commonly, like there's legal medical drugs, prescription, non-prescription. There are legal recreational drugs like alcohol and marijuana. Then there's illegal drugs. And one of the additional risks with illegal drugs is that the standardization and control isn't quite there. Like, what was that crack cut with, right? What is the dose of that? And you'll remember from the brain unit that a lot of the research we have on the brain is really done on rat studies. So maybe there's a rat study about a medication that you're on. But where is the rat study that's about being on an antidepressant and maybe having a benzo for the anxiety and maybe also using marijuana from time to time, right? There's no rat study for that. And doctors try to keep track of this stuff, but sometimes you have different providers. And one person doesn't know everything you're on, and maybe you're not telling them about the other things that you're doing. And we do see tragic cases when people mix a lot of stuff, right? So there is a passage in the text I want to bring up because I think it's a little problematic, okay? So it describes smokers as having a repulsive addiction that slowly but surely turns you into a gasping, gray skin, tumor-ridden invalid, hacking up brownish gobs of toxic waste from your one remaining lung. I do notice that the text tries to enliven with jokes. In the professional practice of psychology, we have to be aware of how we relate to people, and that can include marginalized people, right? And the role of stigma in mental illness. So words like repulsive and invalid are never appropriate in describing individuals with substance use disorders or the long-term consequences of the disorders, even if they're harmful for the person or for society, right? So even as a means of promoting prevention or supporting behavior change towards better habits. Human behavior, and that includes health behavior, happens in complex contexts, and those contexts do include social determinants of health, like the accessibility to opportunities, to education, to support services. I think this is a good example of stigma. Do you know what I mean when I say stigma? So stigma is a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person. And what stands out to me here, there's an attitude of contempt, of disgust, of applying shame. And if you become a clinical psychologist, you will be working with people who, by definition, because they have mental illness, and this is what mental illness is defined as, are behaving maladaptively and harmfully to themselves and to others. And you can't make fun of them. So your job will be to help them, and good relationships and effective therapeutic alliances are never based on contempt. Now, this is opinion and not science, but there is an old principle that holds that we, like as individuals, as organizations, as nations, we don't show our character in those who can do something for us, like those with power or with status. So most people in most places sort of attend to the needs of people who are doing well, people who are successful, people who have status very well, right? We all treat our kings or our royals well. But now ask, right? How do you treat your prisoners, right? How do you treat those who are cast off? People who can't really do something for you, who can't like advocate for or defend themselves, or people who sort of tax or trouble or threaten you. Okay, so who's scapegoated is those who have less power. Okay, so I don't love that quote for many reasons, including kind of the way it treats people who may be acting that way because of so many reasons, some of which are social. And I don't, you know, he's doing this to his younger self, but I would say that to some extent, you sort of show your values and how you treat yourself. Okay. So why do some people become users of consciousness altering drugs? There are genetic reasons. So there's heritability and alcohol use disorders. There are psychological factors that drive people to sort of feel better from taking something, right? To drink. And there's also society and culture. So maybe we've been taught that alcohol makes you feel better. Maybe it's something that parents or friends have modeled. So what can we do to help? One is teaching refusal skills. So sometimes people do something and have a craving, but there's a skill in addressing a craving. It comes like a wave, and if you let it crest, it'll go away again. Before we go, because we're out of time, there's one thing I want to point out, okay? This is in your book. Educate young people about the long-term costs of a drug's temporary pleasures. Those interventions can be iatrogenic, and one of those is the DARE program, drug abuse, resistance, and education. When police officers came into classrooms to talk about how drugs are bad, it resulted in higher rates of drug use. Okay, so just because there's a program doesn't mean it's a good thing. Thank you for your time.